Niels Bohr was a Danish Nobel Prize-winning physicist.
Well, Bohr made it seem hopeful. Spoke with contempt of Hitler, who with a few hundred tanks and planes had tried to enslave Europe for a long, long time. Said nothing like that would ever happen again.
Hello, and welcome back to the National Security Science Podcast, which is the podcast for the National Security Science magazine. We are recording from Los Alamos National Laboratory in northern New Mexico. Today, we talk about our first laboratory director, J. Robert Oppenheimer, who came to Los Alamos during World War II, and the man who is often referred to as the father of the atomic bomb.
Control shack was Dr. J.R. Oppenheimer.
Automatic controls done it now.
If you are unfamiliar with Oppenheimer, please check out the latest National Security Science magazine at lanl.gov/magazine. The theme being Oppenheimer.
Oppenheimer. Dr. Oppenheimer.
This magazine includes all kinds of history, including images and anecdotes of Oppenheimer's lives during and after World War II. There's also a great article by J. Weston Phippen about Los Alamos employees who played extras in the Christopher Nolan blockbuster film Oppenheimer, inspired by the book American Prometheus by Kai Bird.
Let's go recruit some scientists.
Before we start, let's welcome National Security Science writer Jill Gibson for today's Labcast, a minute to highlight current achievements at Los Alamos.
On today's Labcast, the National Security Research Center has released a documentary on Oppenheimer.
Was he a hero? Yes, I think he deserves that title. But like all heroes throughout history, he was a flawed hero.
NSRC director Bryce Steeves says they created the film to show the influence of the lab's first director and how that relates to our work today. His story is ours to tell, and we're in a unique position to do so.
A state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
You had the drive of wartime urgency. The laboratory under his leadership responded to that.
I have watched this documentary and it is fantastic, broken into 3 30-minute videos about Oppenheimer on the topics of science, legacy, and mission. It is a must-watch for anyone interested in Oppenheimer. Which brings us to today's podcast, in which National Security Science writer Ian Laird narrates along with a special recording of Oppenheimer from his return to Los Alamos in 1964. Oppenheimer spoke to a packed audience at Los Alamos High School about Niels Bohr, and in the National Security Research Center documentary, Kai Bird talks about how if Niels Bohr was the founder of quantum physics, Oppenheimer was the prophet. So Oppenheimer had a lot of respect and admiration for Niels Bohr, as you will see in this talk. So without further ado, here is Ian Laird.
Niels Bohr was a Danish Nobel Prize-winning physicist who helped revolutionize physics in the early to mid-1900s. His development of the Bohr model of the atom, where electrons occupied stable orbits around a nucleus, but could jump between orbits, was groundbreaking and helped him win the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1922. When World War II broke out, Bohr was living in Copenhagen, but he would soon escape to Britain. From there, he became involved in the British nuclear weapons program and made frequent trips to Los Alamos to aid in the development of nuclear weapons under the Manhattan Project. Through that, he became a mentor to younger physicists and a confidant of Robert Oppenheimer. After the war, Bohr became an advocate for international cooperation when it came to nuclear weapons, and in 1957, he earned the first Atoms for Peace Award because of those efforts. Just 5 years later, on November 18, 1962, Bohr died of heart failure in his home in Denmark. 2 years after Bohr's death, Oppenheimer gave a speech in Los Alamos on his life and contributions to the world of science. What are about to follow are selected excerpts from that speech, beginning with an introduction by Norris Bradbury, who was the director of Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory at the time and Oppenheimer's hand-picked successor.
At the time when it was rapidly being discerned that an atomic bomb would be possible, a laboratory had to be established somewhere, and a man had to be picked to direct that laboratory. The place was called Project Y, and its address, Box 1663, Santa Fe, New Mexico, and the director of that laboratory was Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, professor of physics at the University of California. This man, known to all of you, is again with us tonight. To me, and I'm sure to all of you, it is the greatest of pleasures to welcome him again to Los Alamos to speak to us tonight. Dr. Oppenheimer.
You almost made me forget my harness. Thank you for that wonderful welcome. And thank you, Dr. Bradbury, for what you said and all you didn't say. I'm very glad to be back. I know there are many old friends in this hall, and I know that the things that I am to talk about are very close to all your hearts.
In the years following Bohr's 1939 return to Denmark, Nazi Germany began its conquest of Europe. Denmark quickly fell under German occupation in 1940, but unlike many of the bright scientific minds of his generation, Bohr opted to remain in his home country initially. During that time, the Nazi regime tried, on multiple occasions, to recruit Bohr and to pry information from him that might help their nuclear weapons program. That included visits from Werner Heisenberg, who headed the Nazi nuclear weapons program, and Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, another leading German physicist.
Not very much is in the public domain about those years during which Denmark was occupied. Heisenberg and von Weizsäcker came over from Germany, and so did many others. Bohr had the impression that they came less to tell what they knew than to see if Bohr knew anything that they didn't, and I believe it was a standoff. Then in 43, it became far too dangerous, and it was clear that Bohr would be killed. So in the last days of September, one night he escaped in a small boat to Sweden, and 3 weeks later he was flown to England in the bomb bay of an unarmed mosquito. They gave him an oxygen mask and a headgear with earphones, but the Royal Air Force wasn't used to heads like Bohr's, and he didn't have any oxygen, and he passed out. Was once in England and revived. Chadwick talked with him and told him about what was going on. And to Bohr, the enterprises in this country seemed completely fantastic. The fact that there was a great diffusion plant separating uranium isotopes in Oak Ridge, and the fact that Ernest Lawrence was making uranium atoms fly through a vacuum so he could pick out the light ones, and the fact that there were plutonium making reactors building in Hanford, and the fact that there was even a place in New Mexico waiting for all this, getting ready for all this. This made an enormous impression on me. The English were very much involved, more than is generally known in this country. I believe that the clarity of the British government on this had a very great effect in converting the American effort from a series of committees so secret from each other that they could make no progress into a major, very major enterprise.
Shortly after escaping Nazi-occupied Denmark, Bohr made his first visit to the United States, and for the first time gained an understanding of what exactly the US and the UK were undertaking with their nuclear weapons programs. He offered clairvoyant views on the effect the weapons would have, and followed up with warnings and recommendations in a series of writings and conversations which Oppenheimer summarized in his speech.
First of all, he was clear that if it worked, this development was going to bring an enormous change in the situation of the world, in the whole situation of war and the tolerability of war. The word menace, the word threat, occur over and over again. When he came here, his first serious question was, is it really big enough? Well, I don't know what it was, but it did finally get to be. The second point was that he knew that enough of how things were in Russia to be quite confident that the wartime alliance would not endure the peace. He therefore anticipated an unheard of arms race, unheard of before then, though we've lived through it and are living through it now, for these great weapons. And he wanted to try to stop this arms race, but to do much else beside. He was clear that one could not have an effective control of what was then still sometimes called atomic energy, which would permit useful applications and free science and a free spirit of inquiry without a very open world. He made this quite absolute. He thought that one would have to have privacy. He thought one would have to have respect for individual quiet and the quiet processes of government and of management. But in principle, everything that might be a threat to the security of the world would have to be open to the world.
Despite some misgivings, Bohr did not remain sidelined during the development of the atomic bomb. He provided key insight at Los Alamos and helped shape the culture of the facility during his short but frequent visits.
But his real function, I think for almost all of us, was not the technical one. He made the enterprise, which was not free of misgiving. Your director for the last 19 years was not at all sure he wanted to have anything to do with this enterprise. And many others who were here were troubled about what we were up to. Well, Bohr made it seem hopeful. He spoke with contempt of Hitler, who with a few hundred tanks and planes that tried to enslave Europe for a long, long time, said nothing like that would ever happen again.
Early on, Bohr recognized the importance of collaboration between political and scientific leaders, and he made frequent attempts to contact and converse with Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In constantly pushing for open dialogue with the Soviet Union about the development of atomic weapons, Bohr became somewhat of an irritant to Churchill and Roosevelt, who dismissed his ideas and at one point had him monitored because of his seemingly sympathetic views toward the Soviet Union.
This was indeed rather a grave development. For one thing, it shows that really very great men dealing with a pretty great man can be very wrong.
Even though his conversations about the merits of collaboration with the Soviet Union often fell on deaf ears, Bohr was not dissuaded from his beliefs. Bohr believed that the testing of an implosion device could serve as a way of revealing what was known while strengthening trust between the Allied nations.
Indeed, it need hardly be stressed how fortunate in every respect it would be if, at the same time as the world will know of the formidable destructive power which has come into human hands, it could be told that the great scientific and technical advance has been helpful in creating a solid foundation for a future peaceful cooperation between nations.
Ultimately, Bohr's ideas of an open world with cooperation amongst the greater world powers didn't bear out. What did come to pass was the arms race Bohr had predicted between the United States and the Soviet Union.
With the development of the arms race, its intensification, the bitterness of the Cold War, the multi-megaton warheads and the rockets, Bohr concentrated more and more on what he knew he could do, on international cooperation in science, on good communication, on proper institutions, on goodwill. He talked of his old interests with anyone who cared to listen. And in June of '62, at Lindau with other Nobel laureates, he had a light stroke. He appeared to be recovering, and in October, he started recording the first 5 interviews of what were to be a history of quantum physics, so certainly in part anyway, a history of Bohr. On the 18th of November, he died, in retrospect, incomplete.
Before concluding his speech, Oppenheimer left his listeners with one last parting thought. Colonel Henry Stimson had served as the Secretary of War during World War II and had overseen the Manhattan Project. Stimson was horrified by the power of atomic weapons and joined Bohr and others in advocating for collaboration with the Soviet Union in the final days of World War II. Later that year, in September of 1945 though, he gave up his efforts and decided to retire. In preparation for his retirement ceremony, he went to get a haircut and invited Oppenheimer to chat with him.
And he asked me to sit with him when he was in the barber's chair. When it was time to go, he said, "Now it is in your hands." Bohr never said anything like that to anybody. He did not need to. Thank you.
Unlike Stimson, Bohr never gave up on the idea of an open world regarding nuclear weapons. He didn't believe in passing off the responsibility for someone else to take care of.
Thanks, Ian. Before we end this podcast, National Security Science writer Weston Pippin will bring you highlights from the Hill, stories that could only happen in Los Alamos.
In the Santa Fe, New Mexican newspaper, lab scientist Kimberly Worth wrote about how she used a scanning electron microscope to analyze something that might feel out of the lab's purview: bird eggshells. The article is headlined, "Southwest New Mexico Ruins Reveal Ancient Macaw Breeding Site." Worth states, "I'm working with a team on a project that focuses on exploring whether the indigenous people of the Mimbres culture at the Old Town Ruin site in southwestern New Mexico included individuals skilled in the care and breeding of these Central and South American birds. For reasons unclear to us, the intense, colorful birds were important enough to transport them far from their native woodlands, breed them here in New Mexico, and later bury them within the community, along with their eggs." The scanning electron microscope is used to survey a variety of micron-scale samples. For example, our device is often used to determine the abundance and distribution of radioactive actinide particles on a sample surface.
The article is linked on the Los Alamos National Laboratory homepage. Thank you to the National Security Science Research Center for providing the recording of Oppenheimer. And thank you so much for listening to the National Security Science Podcast. Don't forget to check out National Security Science Magazine online at lanl.gov/magazine, that's lanl.gov/magazine, to learn more about how better science equals better national security. For more great stories from Los Alamos, including several other podcasts, video series, and interactive stories, visit discover.lanl.gov.